The first gunshot did not kill anyone, but it ended 3 lives at once. The bullet lodged into the kitchen wall inches from Mara's head, spraying plaster into her hair like gray snow. And for a moment, no one breathed, not even the little boy standing between them with a glass of water trembling in his hand. The sound was louder than it should have been, louder than the years they had spent pretending not to hear each other. Adrian stood there with the pistol still raised, his arms shaking, his face drained of blood as if the weapon had pulled something out of him instead of firing something away. "I didn't mean to," he said, but he did not lower the gun, and that was the detail that changed everything. Mara did not scream. She stared at the hole in the wall as if it were an answer she had been waiting for, as if she had always known this was the shape of their marriage. Her voice came out thin but steady when she said, "Eli, go to your room." The boy did not move. His eyes were fixed on his father, not with fear, but with something worse. A calculation that did not belong on an 8-year-old's face. Adrian saw that look and felt the ground tilt under him. He had fired to stop her from leaving, to freeze the moment, to scare her into staying long enough to listen. But now he understood that he had fired into his son's memory, and that echo would never fade. Eli finally set the glass down on the table, with deliberate care. "Dad," he said quietly, "you said you'd never do that." Adrian wanted to tell him that promises were flexible under pressure, that men broke when pushed, that adults were allowed to unravel. Instead, he swallowed and lowered the gun an inch, just enough to show uncertainty, but not enough to erase the threat. Mara stepped sideways, placing herself fully between Adrian and their son, and that small movement felt like a door slamming shut. "Put it down," she said. "If you love him at all, put it down." He should have. He knew that. But love had become a weapon in their house long before the gun arrived. "You were taking him," Adrian replied, his voice cracking. "You were walking out like I don't exist." Mara's eyes flashed, not with rage but with exhaustion. "You haven't existed for months," she said. "You just hover here, watching, accusing, rewriting everything I say." The words hit harder than the recoil. Adrian wanted to argue, to insist that he was the only one holding this family together. But the gun in his hand made every defense sound absurd. When the police arrived 10 minutes later, it was Eli who had called them. Adrian did not even realize his son had slipped away to grab the phone. The sirens cut through the night, red and blue light flooding the kitchen, turning the cracked plaster into something theatrical. Officers burst in with weapons drawn, shouting commands that felt distant and unreal. Adrian dropped the gun then, finally, but it was too late to change the image burned into everyone's mind. As they forced him to the ground, pressing his cheek against the cold tile, he heard Mara sob for the first time, and the sound was not for him. In the back of the squad car, Adrian tried to reconstruct the moment before the shot. He searched for the exact second where he could have chosen differently, where he could have lowered his voice instead of raising the gun. He told himself that he had never intended to hurt anyone, that it was only a warning, a desperate punctuation mark at the end of a sentence that had been ignored for years. But intention felt irrelevant now. What mattered was that Eli had watched his father pull a trigger. At the station, under fluorescent lights that made everything look sickly, Adrian replayed Mara's final words before the officers dragged him away. "You need help," she had said, not cruelly, but with finality. He had laughed at that, a brittle sound that even he did not recognize. Help was for people who admitted weakness. He had spent his life proving he could endure anything without bending. Yet here he was, wrists sore from handcuffs, waiting for someone to decide whether he was dangerous or just broken. The charge was aggravated assault with a firearm. No one had been injured, which felt like mercy disguised as luck. His lawyer, a thin man named Calder with patient eyes, told him the situation could have been worse. "It will depend on your wife's statement," Calder said, tapping a pen against a legal pad. "If she pushes for it, this becomes a long road." Adrian flinched at the word wife. It sounded outdated already. "She won't," he said automatically, clinging to a version of Mara who still protected him. Calder did not argue, but his silence carried doubt. Bail was set high, higher than Adrian expected. He had to call his brother, Lucas, a man he had not spoken to in nearly a year. When Lucas answered, there was no surprise in his voice, only a weary acceptance. "I heard sirens from across town," he said. "I wondered if it was you." Adrian bristled at the implication, but he swallowed his pride and explained what happened, or at least his version of it. Lucas listened without interrupting, which felt worse than being judged. "I'll cover it," Lucas said finally. "But this isn't about money, is it?" When Adrian stepped out of the station the next morning, the air felt unfamiliar, like he had crossed into a different city overnight. Lucas was waiting by his car, arms folded, face tight with restrained frustration. They did not hug, they did not exchange pleasantries. "Get in," Lucas said. As they drove, silence pressed against the windows. Adrian wanted to fill it with explanations, with narratives that made him the misunderstood one. But every version sounded hollow even in his own head. Mara had taken Eli to her sister's house. She had not answered Adrian's messages. The house they had shared for 11 years now felt like a crime scene, the hole in the wall covered by a rough square of cardboard. Adrian stood in the kitchen, staring at it, imagining Eli's small body in that space. He touched the edge of the damage and felt a surge of nausea. "You didn't mean to," he whispered to himself, as if repetition could reshape reality. But meaning had already been replaced by consequence. That night, alone in the bedroom, Adrian found the half-packed suitcase Mara had been dragging toward the door before the shot. Inside were Eli's clothes, some of her jewelry, a folder of documents he did not recognize. He flipped through them and realized they were copies of bank statements, insurance policies, and a rental agreement for an apartment across town. She had not been bluffing. She had been planning. The knowledge felt like betrayal. Yet he could not deny that he had given her reasons. He lay on the bed and stared at the ceiling, replaying the months leading up to this point. The arguments that started small and spiraled into accusations. The way he monitored her phone, convinced she was hiding something. The late nights he spent in the garage, building imaginary cases against her instead of listening. He had told himself he was protecting his family from lies, from secrets, from threats only he could see. Now he wondered if he had been protecting himself from his own fear of abandonment. The next day, Calder called with an update. Mara had given her statement. She had confirmed that Adrian fired the gun during an argument but insisted he had not aimed directly at her. She described it as reckless and terrifying, Calder said carefully. But she did not say you intended to kill her. Adrian clung to that distinction like a lifeline. So she's not pushing for prison, he said. Calder hesitated. She's asking for a restraining order. The words felt heavier than the gun had. A restraining order meant distance enforced by law. It meant he could not see his son without supervision, could not step into the house without permission. It meant Mara had crossed from fear to action. She's overreacting, Adrian muttered. Even as a part of him recognized the absurdity of that claim. Calder's voice hardened slightly. You fired a weapon inside your home, he said. That is not small. Lucas came by that evening with groceries, as if Adrian were incapable of feeding himself. They sat at the kitchen table, the cardboard square still visible on the wall. You scared them, Lucas said quietly. Adrian bristled. I scared her, he corrected. Eli knows I would never hurt him. Lucas leaned back, studying his brother with a mixture of pity and frustration. He doesn't know that anymore, he replied. He saw you choose anger over safety. Adrian wanted to argue, to insist that he had been pushed beyond reason, that Mara had orchestrated the entire confrontation to paint him as unstable. He began listing the small slights, the hidden phone calls, the emotional distance. Lucas listened but did not nod. Even if she was planning to leave, Lucas said slowly, you had options that didn't involve a gun. The simplicity of that statement cut deeper than any accusation. Adrian felt cornered by logic. The court hearing for the restraining order was set for the following week. Adrian was instructed not to contact Mara or Eli until then. The house became a silent container of memories, each room echoing with arguments he had tried to forget. He found himself speaking aloud to no one, rehearsing apologies he was not ready to deliver. In the bathroom mirror, his reflection looked unfamiliar, eyes hollowed by sleepless nights. You are not a monster, he told himself, but the words lacked conviction. Mara, meanwhile, was constructing a different narrative for survival. At her sister's dining table, she replayed the gunshot in her mind, not as a mistake, but as a warning of what could come next. She remembered the way Adrian's hand had trembled, not with fear, but with desperation. She had seen that look before in smaller forms, in slammed doors and shattered plates. The escalation had been gradual, almost imperceptible, until it wasn't. She told herself she was protecting Eli, even if it meant becoming the villain in Adrian's story. Eli stopped asking when he could go home. Instead, he began asking if his father was sick. Mara struggled with the question. He's having a hard time, she said carefully. Eli nodded, as if that explained everything, but his eyes remained distant. At night, he slept with the hallway light on, something he had not done in years. Mara would stand outside his room, listening to his breathing, wondering how a single sound could fracture a child's sense of safety so completely. Adrian did not know about the hallway light. He imagined Eli missing him, longing for the familiar rhythm of their evenings together. He clung to that image to avoid confronting the possibility that his son might be afraid. When Lucas suggested therapy, Adrian scoffed. I'm not unstable, he insisted. I just lost control for a second. Lucas did not argue. He simply handed Adrian a business card for a counselor and said, Then prove it. The first session felt like an interrogation. The therapist, Dr. Halpern, had a calm demeanor that Adrian found irritating. She asked about the gunshot without flinching, about his childhood, about his fears. He deflected, minimized, reframed. He described Mara as distant, secretive, manipulative. Dr. Halpern listened, and then asked, "What did you feel right before you pulled the trigger?" The question lingered in the room like smoke. Adrian opened his mouth to answer and found nothing coherent. He wanted to say he felt betrayed. He wanted to say he felt abandoned. But beneath those words was something rawer, something he did not want to examine. "I felt invisible," he admitted finally. The confession surprised him. Dr. Halpern nodded slowly. "And you believed a gun would make you visible?" The statement was not accusatory, but it landed with undeniable weight. Adrian felt exposed in a way that felt more dangerous than handcuffs. As the days crawled toward the hearing, tension thickened. Mara prepared herself for the possibility of seeing Adrian in court, rehearsing boundaries she had never needed before. Adrian prepared arguments in his head, convinced he could persuade the judge, or at least Mara, that he was still the man they once trusted. Neither of them realized that the real shift had already occurred in Eli's quiet recalibration of what safety meant. The morning of the hearing arrived with a dull gray sky. Adrian stood outside the courthouse, suit pressed, jaw tight, trying to project stability. Lucas stood beside him, hands in his pockets, ready to intervene if necessary. Across the steps, Mara approached with her sister, Eli walking between them. When Adrian saw his son, a surge of longing nearly knocked him off balance. He took a step forward instinctively, then remembered the temporary order prohibiting contact. Eli looked up and met his father's gaze. There was no smile, no wave, just a long, searching look that felt older than his years. Adrian tried to communicate reassurance through his expression, but he was not sure what reassurance looked like anymore. Mara kept her eyes forward, her posture rigid, as if any acknowledgement might weaken her resolve. The distance between them was measured in feet, but it felt immeasurable. Inside the courtroom, the air was thick with quiet tension. The judge listened to both sides with professional detachment. Mara described the argument, the escalating accusations, the sudden crack of the gunshot. She did not embellish. She did not dramatize. Her restraint made the story more credible. Adrian's lawyer emphasized that no one had been injured, that Adrian had no prior criminal record, that he had begun therapy voluntarily. When Adrian was asked to speak, he stood and felt the weight of every gaze in the room. He wanted to apologize, but pride tangled with fear. "I made a mistake," he said instead. "I was overwhelmed. I never intended to harm my family." The words sounded rehearsed, even to him. The judge studied him for a long moment before delivering a measured decision. The restraining order would remain in place temporarily, with supervised visitation granted pending further evaluation. The gavel's sound was softer than the gunshot, but it carried a different kind of finality. Adrian felt something collapse inside him. Not entirely visible, but undeniably real. He had not lost everything, but he had lost control over how his story would unfold. As the courtroom emptied, he watched Mara guide Eli toward the exit. For a brief second, Eli looked back again, and Adrian could not decipher whether that glance held hope or warning. Outside, Lucas placed a hand on Adrian's shoulder. "This is not the end," he said quietly. Adrian nodded, but the words felt hollow. He understood now that survival would not mean reclaiming what he had, but facing what he had become. And he was not certain he was ready for that confrontation. The supervised visitation was scheduled for Saturday morning at a family services building that smelled faintly of disinfectant and old carpet. Adrian arrived 30 minutes early, pacing the narrow hallway outside the designated room as if he were preparing for a job interview rather than a meeting with his own son. He had shaved carefully, chosen a sweater, Eli once said, made him look less mad, and practiced neutral expressions in the car mirror. None of it quieted the tremor in his hands. He told himself that this was temporary, procedural, that soon they would laugh about how dramatic the system had been. When Mara walked in with Eli, she did not look at Adrian. She spoke to the supervisor, a middle-aged woman named Karen, who wore a badge and an expression of professional neutrality. "We'll be in room 3, Karen said gently, ushering Adrian and Eli inside while Mara remained in the waiting area. The door closed with a soft click that sounded louder than it should have. The room contained a small table, 2 plastic chairs, and a shelf of board games. The artificial brightness felt accusatory. Adrian crouched to Eli's eye level, resisting the urge to hug him. "Hey, champ," he said, aiming for casual warmth. Eli stood stiffly, hands in his jacket pockets. "Hi," he replied, his voice careful. That caution cut deeper than any anger could have. They sat across from each other, the table between them an invisible barrier. Karen positioned herself near the wall with a clipboard, pretending not to listen, while clearly listening to everything. Adrian asked about school, about math tests and recess. Eli answered politely, offering short sentences that closed rather than opened conversation. Adrian sensed the distance and panicked internally, searching for something to bridge it. "I'm sorry about the other night," Adrian said finally, the words heavier than he expected. Eli's eyes flicked up. "Mom said you were scared," he replied. Adrian swallowed. "I was," he admitted. "I felt like everything was changing too fast." He wanted to say that adults sometimes made bad choices when they were afraid, but that explanation felt thin. Eli looked at his hands. "When you're scared, you don't shoot," he said quietly. The sentence landed with devastating simplicity. Adrian felt his chest tighten. "You're right," he said after a moment. "I was wrong." The admission tasted foreign but necessary. Silence stretched between them. Adrian reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wooden airplane he had carved during sleepless nights in the garage. "I made this for you," he said, sliding it across the table. Eli picked it up, turning it over with cautious curiosity. "It's nice," he said, and for the first time, there was a hint of genuine warmth in his tone. They played a board game after that, the structured rules providing relief from emotional uncertainty. Adrian forced himself not to overcompensate, not to flood the room with forced enthusiasm. He focused on listening, on letting Eli speak without interruption. When the hour ended, Karen cleared her throat gently. "Time's up," she said. Adrian stood slowly. "I'll see you next week," he told Eli. It felt like asking rather than stating. Eli nodded, clutching the wooden airplane. As he walked out, he hesitated at the door and glanced back. "Don't get scared again," he said softly, before disappearing into the hallway. Adrian remained standing long after the door closed, absorbing the weight of that request. The sessions continued weekly. Each one exposed new fractures in their dynamic. Eli became more articulate about his fears, describing how the sound of a slammed locker at school made his heart race. Adrian listened with a mixture of guilt and defensiveness, tempted to argue that children were resilient, but he could not deny the tremor in Eli's voice when he described the gunshot. Meanwhile, Mara began her own therapy. She found herself oscillating between anger and self-doubt. Part of her feared she had escalated the situation by confronting Adrian too directly about leaving. Another part recognized that his reaction had been disproportionate regardless of her timing. Her therapist asked, "When did you first feel unsafe?" Mara struggled to pinpoint a moment. The unease had crept in gradually, disguised as protectiveness. She remembered the way Adrian would check her phone just to be sure. The way he questioned her tone, her friendships, her late returns from work. None of it had seemed violent at first. It had felt like intensity mistaken for devotion. Now she saw the pattern differently, as if a lens had shifted. The gunshot was not an isolated event, but the loudest note in a long, discordant melody. Adrian, under Dr. Halpern's persistent guidance, began tracing his fear of invisibility back to childhood. His father had been a quiet man, distant and critical, measuring worth in achievements rather than affection. Adrian had learned early that mistakes were magnified and vulnerability was punished. "You think if you lose control first, no one can abandon you," Dr. Halpern observed one afternoon. Adrian bristled, but the idea lingered. He realized that Mara's decision to leave had triggered not just marital fear, but a deeper narrative of being discarded. The gun had been less about stopping her physically, and more about halting that narrative. Yet, understanding did not absolve him. It merely clarified the terrain of his own dysfunction. "Insight doesn't erase impact," Dr. Halpern reminded him. The legal process crawled forward. The court required Adrian to attend anger management classes. He sat in a circle with strangers who had their own stories of loss of control. Some minimized their actions. Others wept openly. Adrian oscillated between superiority and shame. He did not see himself in the men who had thrown punches, yet he could not deny that he had introduced a weapon into his home. Lucas continued to hover at the edges of Adrian's life, offering practical support without overt judgment. One evening, over takeout containers scattered across the kitchen counter, Lucas said, "You keep talking about what she did. You don't talk about what you're afraid of losing." Adrian stared at the cardboard square on the wall. "I already lost it," he muttered. Lucas shook his head. "Not the house. The illusion that you're in control." The words unsettled Adrian more than any accusation. He had built his identity around stability, around being the dependable one. The idea that control had been an illusion felt destabilizing, yet he could not deny that his attempts to enforce certainty had produced chaos. He began to question whether his love for Mara had been intertwined with a need to contain her. Mara, for her part, wrestled with guilt over Eli's divided loyalty. He began drawing pictures of their family separated by thick lines. In some drawings, Adrian stood outside the house entirely. When Mara asked about it, Eli shrugged. "It's safer that way," he said. The comment pierced her. She did not want her son to internalize fear as normal. At the third supervised visit, Eli asked Adrian directly, "Are you going to jail?" Adrian hesitated. "I don't think so," he said carefully. "I'm working to make sure that doesn't happen." Eli nodded, processing. "If you go to jail, can I visit you?" The question was not dramatic. It was logistical. Adrian felt tears sting his eyes, but forced himself to remain composed. "I hope it doesn't come to that," he replied, "but if it did, I'd want to see you." After the session, Adrian sat in his car and allowed himself to cry for the first time since the arrest. The sobs were not loud, but they were relentless. He gripped the steering wheel and confronted a truth he had been avoiding. His son was preparing for worst-case scenarios because he no longer trusted stability. That erosion was his responsibility. The court ordered a psychological evaluation to assess Adrian's risk factors. The evaluator, a stern woman with a precise manner, asked about his thought patterns, his jealousy, his perception of threats. Adrian found himself defensive again, aware that his answers could influence custody decisions. He struggled to balance honesty with self-preservation. Mara received updates through her lawyer. Each report forced her to reconsider the future. She did not want Eli to grow up without a father, yet she could not ignore the escalation. Her sister urged her to file for divorce immediately. "He crossed a line," she insisted. Mara nodded, but hesitated. The finality of divorce felt overwhelming, even after everything. One evening, Mara and Adrian encountered each other unexpectedly in the parking lot of a grocery store. The restraining order allowed incidental contact but prohibited conversation. They stood several yards apart, carts between them like shields. For a moment, neither moved. Adrian wanted to apologize again, to explain his progress, to ask if there was any path back. Mara saw the plea in his eyes and felt her resolve waver. But then she remembered the sound of the gunshot and the way Eli had flinched. She turned away without speaking. Adrian remained frozen, watching her disappear into the store. The absence of words felt louder than any argument they had ever had. As months passed, the supervised visits gradually became less tense. Eli began sharing more about his daily life, about a classmate who teased him and a teacher who praised his drawings. Adrian focused on consistency, on showing up without drama. He resisted the urge to criticize Mara, even subtly. Each session felt like a test he could not afford to fail. Dr. Halpern pushed Adrian to confront the possibility that reconciliation might not be the goal. "What if the work is about becoming safe, not about winning her back?" she asked. Adrian recoiled at the framing. He had assumed progress would naturally lead to restoration. The idea that Mara might still choose distance unsettled him deeply. Meanwhile, Mara observed changes from afar. Eli no longer recoiled at the mention of his father. He spoke of the visits with cautious neutrality. "He listens more," Eli said one night. Mara felt a complicated mix of relief and resentment. She wanted Adrian to improve for Eli's sake, but part of her bristled at the possibility that he could change now, after forcing her into crisis. The next court review approached. Adrian's compliance with therapy and anger management worked in his favor. The judge considered expanding visitation to unsupervised daytime outings. Mara's stomach tightened at the suggestion. She trusted the structure of supervision. Removing it felt like relinquishing a safeguard. In the courtroom, tension coiled beneath formal language. Adrian stood straighter, projecting stability. Mara spoke calmly about her concerns without attacking his character. The judge approved a trial period of unsupervised visits under strict conditions. Adrian felt a surge of relief, quickly tempered by awareness of the responsibility attached. The first unsupervised outing was to a public park. Adrian arrived early again, scanning the area as if it were a security risk. When Eli approached with Mara, Adrian sensed her hesitation. "Call me if anything feels wrong," she told Eli, her voice steady but tight. Eli nodded, then turned to his father with cautious excitement. They walked toward the playground together. Adrian felt hyper-aware of every movement, determined to avoid any hint of volatility. They sat on a bench, watching other families. "It's weird," Eli said suddenly. "Being alone with you." Adrian nodded slowly. "I know," he replied. "It's weird for me too." Eli studied him. "Are you different now?" he asked. Adrian considered the question carefully. "I'm trying to be," he said. "Different in a better way." Eli accepted the answer with a small shrug and ran toward the swings. Adrian watched him, feeling both pride and fear. Halfway through the visit, a loud bang echoed from a nearby construction site. Eli froze mid-step, eyes wide. Adrian felt his own heart spike, but forced himself to remain calm. He walked toward his son slowly. "It's just construction," he said gently. "No danger." Eli's breathing slowed gradually. Adrian realized then that the sound had triggered both of them differently, and how he responded now mattered more than any apology. They returned to the bench, sitting quietly. Eli leaned against his father tentatively. Adrian resisted the urge to overreact. He simply placed an arm around him, steady and firm. In that small gesture, there was progress, but not absolution. When the visit ended, Mara studied Eli's expression carefully. He appeared calm, even slightly content. Adrian met her gaze briefly, an unspoken acknowledgement passing between them. The path forward remained uncertain, but it was no longer defined solely by that single gunshot. Still, beneath the surface, unresolved tension simmered. Trust was fragile. One misstep could unravel months of effort. Adrian knew that redemption, if it existed, would not be a grand gesture but a series of restrained choices, and he was only at the beginning of learning how to make them. The illusion of progress fractured 3 weeks later, not with another gunshot, but with a sentence spoken too quickly. Adrian had taken Eli to a science museum downtown, a carefully chosen neutral space filled with structured exhibits and predictable noise. They moved from one display to another, reading placards about space travel and electrical currents. Adrian felt cautiously optimistic, encouraged by the way Eli explained facts with growing enthusiasm. For the first time, their conversation flowed without visible strain. It happened near the robotics section. Eli mentioned that his friend Caleb's parents were getting divorced. "He says it's better because they stopped yelling," Eli said, eyes fixed on a mechanical arm stacking blocks. Adrian felt something tighten in his chest. Without thinking, he replied, "Your mom and I wouldn't be in this mess if she hadn't decided to run." The words left his mouth before he could filter them. They hung in the air like a second gunshot, quieter but no less destructive. Eli turned to him slowly. "Mom didn't run," he said. His voice wasn't loud. It was firm. Adrian realized immediately that he had crossed a boundary the court had not written but had clearly implied. He saw Mara's face in his mind, not angry, but exhausted. "I shouldn't have said that," Adrian corrected quickly. "That's between adults." But the correction felt insufficient. Eli stepped back slightly. "You said you weren't going to blame her," he said. Adrian felt exposed. He had promised himself he would not recruit his son into the narrative war, yet under the pressure of casual conversation, resentment had surfaced. "You're right," Adrian said quietly. "I messed up." They finished the museum visit politely, but without the earlier ease. Adrian drove Eli back in near silence, replaying the moment repeatedly. He considered not telling Mara, convincing himself that Eli might forget. But when he dropped his son off, Eli spoke first. "Dad said you ran away," he told Mara in the doorway. Mara's eyes flicked to Adrian instantly. There was no shouting, no accusation, just a steady, assessing look that carried more weight than anger. "We'll talk later," she told Eli gently, guiding him inside. The door closed softly, but the distance it created felt immense. That night, Adrian received an email from Mara. It was brief and composed. She wrote that comments assigning blame during visits violated the spirit of their agreement and undermined Eli's stability. She requested a temporary return to supervised visits if it continued. Adrian read the message multiple times, his defensiveness flaring before dissolving into recognition. He had done exactly what he accused her of doing, using Eli as leverage. He responded carefully, acknowledging his mistake and promising it would not happen again. The apology felt more deliberate than previous ones. It was not about reconciliation. It was about containment, yet he sensed that each misstep tightened the margin for error. Dr. Halpern did not soften her response. "You reverted under stress," she said. "That tells us the narrative of blame is still active." Adrian bristled. "I corrected it immediately," he argued. She nodded. "But the impulse came first. Until you address that impulse, you remain unpredictable." Unpredictable. The word echoed painfully. He had built his life around predictability. He paid bills early, arrived on time, avoided visible conflict at work, yet, in intimate spaces, he oscillated between control and collapse. The contradiction unsettled him. Meanwhile, Mara faced pressure from her family to formalize the separation. Her sister insisted that Adrian's slip at the museum proved that change was superficial. "He still sees you as the enemy," she argued. Mara wanted to defend Adrian's effort, to acknowledge the therapy in classes, but she could not ignore the fact that even small comments had the power to destabilize Eli. At school, Eli's teacher requested a meeting. She described subtle shifts in his behavior, hypervigilance during loud activities, difficulty concentrating after weekends with his father. He seems torn, the teacher said gently. Mara felt a familiar surge of guilt. She wondered whether partial exposure to instability was worse than clean separation. Adrian attended the next therapy session with visible tension. He admitted the museum comment before Dr. Halpern asked. "I didn't plan it," he insisted. "It just came out." She leaned forward slightly. "What did you feel when he mentioned divorce?" Adrian paused. "Like I was losing," he said finally. The word surprised him. "Losing what?" Dr. Halpern pressed. Adrian realized that he still framed the situation as competition rather than responsibility. He had not fully relinquished the idea that he needed to win back authority. The gunshot had been an extreme attempt to freeze departure. The museum comment had been a subtler attempt to reassert narrative control. "You equate separation with defeat," Dr. Halpern observed. "Until that changes, you will keep reacting." Adrian rubbed his temples. "So what am I supposed to do? Accept that I destroyed my marriage?" The bitterness in his voice lingered. "Acceptance is not surrender," she replied. "It's clarity." The court review following the museum incident was tense. Mara reported the comment but acknowledged Adrian's apology and consistent attendance in therapy. The judge issued a warning rather than revoking unsupervised visits, emphasizing the importance of shielding Eli from adult conflict. Adrian felt both relieved and chastened. Lucas confronted him later that week. "You can't keep slipping," Lucas said bluntly. "Every time you do, you confirm her worst fears." Adrian stared at his brother, resentment flickering. "You think I don't know that?" he snapped. Lucas sighed. "Knowing isn't the same as changing." The tension escalated unexpectedly when Adrian's job came under review. A colleague had learned of the arrest through public records and raised concerns with management. Adrian was called into a meeting with HR. The discussion was polite but pointed. They emphasized the company's reputation and the seriousness of the charge, even if it had not resulted in conviction. Adrian left the meeting feeling exposed in a new arena. The stability he clung to professionally now felt precarious. He imagined losing his job on top of partial custody. The pressure mounted, and with it, the temptation to blame external forces intensified. That evening, he nearly called Mara to vent, forgetting the boundaries. He stopped himself, recognizing the old pattern of seeking emotional regulation through confrontation. Instead, he called Dr. Halpern's office and requested an additional session. It felt like surrendering pride, but he knew the alternative was riskier. Mara, unaware of the job threat, focused on preparing for mediation regarding long-term custody arrangements. Her lawyer suggested that demonstrating Adrian's consistent improvement could work in her favor, positioning her as reasonable. The idea of strategic generosity unsettled her. She did not want custody decisions framed as tactical advantage. Eli began asking more complex questions. "If you and Dad don't live together, where do I live when I'm older?" he asked one night. Mara hesitated. "You'll always have both of us," she replied carefully. Eli frowned. "But you don't have each other." The observation was not accusatory. It was analytical. Adrian noticed that Eli's drawings had evolved. Instead of thick lines dividing family members, there were now separate houses connected by a road. The road sometimes had traffic, sometimes not. Adrian interpreted it as tentative progress, though he knew interpretation could be self-serving. During one unsupervised visit, Eli asked to see the kitchen wall where the bullet had struck. Adrian hesitated but agreed. The cardboard square had been replaced with fresh plaster and paint. "It looks normal," Eli said, touching the smooth surface. "But I know it's not." Adrian knelt beside him. "You're right," he said softly. "Some things change even if you can't see them." Eli studied him. "Are you still scared of Mom leaving?" he asked. Adrian inhaled slowly. "I'm scared of a lot of things," he admitted, "but I'm learning how not to let that fear control me." Eli seemed to weigh the answer carefully. "If you get scared again," he said, "you can call someone instead of shooting." Adrian felt both humbled and exposed. "I will," he promised. The mediation session for custody brought all tensions into a confined space. Mara and Adrian sat across from each other with lawyers present. The mediator encouraged collaborative language. Adrian focused on listening, resisting the urge to counter every concern. When Mara described her lingering fear of unpredictability, he felt the impulse to defend but forced himself to remain still. "I need to know that our son will never be in that position again," Mara said quietly. The vulnerability in her tone surprised him. It was not hostility. It was grief. Adrian realized that while he had been focused on his own shame, she had been navigating sustained fear. "I can't erase what happened," Adrian said carefully, "but I can keep working so it doesn't happen again." The statement was simple, stripped of grandiosity. The mediator nodded, noting the shift in tone compared to earlier hearings. The agreement they reached was provisional. Shared custody with continued therapy requirements and clear communication boundaries. It was not reconciliation. It was structured coexistence. Both left the session drained rather than triumphant. Weeks later, a new tension emerged when Lucas revealed that he had spoken privately with Mara about Eli's well-being. Adrian felt betrayed. "You went behind my back," he accused. Lucas met his anger evenly. "I care about him too," he replied. "This isn't about loyalty." The confrontation exposed Adrian's lingering need for control over narrative alliances. He accused Lucas of undermining him. Lucas responded bluntly, "You undermined yourself the night you fired that gun." The sentence stung with undeniable truth. Adrian left the argument unsettled, recognizing that isolation would only amplify his volatility. Yet trust felt complicated. He began to see that repairing one relationship often strained another. Each step toward accountability exposed new fractures. Mara, meanwhile, struggled with the emotional ambiguity of Adrian's improvement. She noticed the way Eli returned from visits calmer than before. She acknowledged Adrian's consistent attendance at school events, his neutral tone in shared communications. Yet, the memory of the gunshot remained visceral. One evening, after Eli fell asleep, Mara found herself scrolling through old photos on her phone. Images of vacations, birthdays, ordinary domestic moments. She wondered whether the man in those photos still existed, or whether she had been projecting safety onto someone already unraveling. The fragile equilibrium shattered when Adrian's HR department informed him that due to reputational risk, he would be placed on probation pending the outcome of his legal case. The decision was framed as precautionary but felt punitive. Adrian's sense of stability wavered again. He considered hiding the news from Mara, fearing it would influence custody. But concealment felt like regression. After agonizing for hours, he informed her via email, emphasizing that it would not affect his financial responsibilities. Mara responded with measured concern, asking whether the stress might impact his therapy. Her question, though practical, felt intrusive. Adrian bristled internally before recognizing the pattern. Stress had been the catalyst before. He could not deny the risk. "I'm managing it," he replied tersely, then immediately regretted the tone. Eli sensed the tension during the next visit. "Are you mad again?" he asked unexpectedly. Adrian shook his head. "I'm frustrated about work," he admitted, "but I'm not mad at you or Mom." Eli nodded slowly. "You look like you did before," he said quietly. The observation unsettled Adrian. He went home and stared at his reflection in the mirror, searching for the expression Eli described. He saw fatigue, resentment, and a flicker of something darker he did not want to name. Dr. Halpern confronted him directly. "You are under renewed pressure," she said. "This is when patterns resurface." Adrian exhaled sharply. "I'm not going to explode again," he insisted. She did not challenge the statement but asked, "What will you do instead?" The question lingered long after the session ended. Adrian understood that progress was not linear. The temptation to revert to control was constant, and now, with professional uncertainty layered onto familial strain, the burden felt heavier than ever. The path forward demanded restraint at every turn. But restraint was exhausting, and exhaustion, Adrian was learning, was a precursor to collapse. The warning proved less theoretical than he wanted to believe. 2 days after the HR meeting, Adrian received an official notice that his probation would extend indefinitely until the criminal case was formally resolved, which could take months. The language was sterile, but the implication was not. He was a liability. He read the email 3 times before closing his laptop and sitting motionless at the kitchen table. The cardboard square was long gone, the wall freshly painted. Yet in his mind the hole reappeared, as if memory refused renovation. He felt the familiar surge of indignation rising, the narrative forming automatically. They were overreacting. He had not harmed anyone. The system was punishing intention rather than outcome. But beneath that defensive rhythm was a quieter fear that he recognized now with uncomfortable clarity. If he lost his job, he would lose more than income. He would lose the final pillar supporting the image he had built of himself. He called Lucas without planning to. When his brother answered, Adrian did not bother with preamble. "They're freezing me out," he said. Lucas listened, absorbing the information without rushing to comfort. "What are you going to do?" he asked calmly. Adrian bristled at the practicality. "What can I do?" he snapped. "They've already decided." Lucas paused. "You can decide how you respond." The sentence felt infuriatingly familiar, like something Dr. Halpern would say. Adrian ended the call abruptly, pacing the living room with restless agitation. He considered driving to the office and confronting HR directly, demanding clarity, forcing recognition of his value. The impulse was visceral, almost physical. He could feel it in his hands, the need to assert presence before invisibility swallowed him. Instead, he stood still in the center of the room and counted his breaths, an exercise he had learned in therapy and secretly despised. Each inhale felt insufficient, each exhale felt forced, but the urge to drive faded slightly. The restraint felt like swallowing broken glass. Later that evening, Eli called unexpectedly. It was not his scheduled time, and Adrian's heart leapt with alarm before he answered. "Hey buddy," he said, injecting steadiness into his voice. Eli hesitated on the other end. "Mom says you might not work for a while," he said carefully. The statement was neutral, but Adrian heard the undercurrent. "I'm still working," Adrian replied, choosing precision over reassurance. "There are just some extra meetings happening." Eli was quiet for a moment. "Are we going to have to move?" he asked. The question sliced through Adrian's defensiveness. He realized that instability radiated outward, affecting far more than pride. "No," Adrian said firmly. "You don't have to worry about that." The certainty in his tone was deliberate. He would not let financial anxiety become another fracture in Eli's sense of security. "Okay," Eli said softly. "Just checking." When the call ended, Adrian felt both protective and exposed. His son was monitoring risk now, calculating potential fallout like a cautious investor. Mara, aware of the probation situation, struggled with conflicting instincts. She wanted to ensure Eli's safety, to shield him from uncertainty. Yet she also recognized that overreacting to Adrian's professional strain could escalate tension. During her own therapy session, she admitted feeling hypervigilant. "I'm waiting for the next explosion," she said quietly. The therapist nodded. "Hypervigilance is common after trauma," she explained. "But constant anticipation can distort perception." Mara bristled at the implication that her caution might be excessive. The memory of the gunshot was not imagined. It had been real and loud and irreversible. Yet she could not deny that even minor shifts in Adrian's tone now triggered disproportionate alarm. She wondered whether she would ever be able to see him without that filter. The following week, Adrian attended Eli's school assembly for a science fair. It was the first public event they had attended together since the arrest. Parents filled the auditorium, chatting casually, unaware of the history simmering beneath Adrian's composed exterior. Mara stood several rows ahead with her sister, maintaining polite distance. When Eli's name was called, Adrian applauded enthusiastically, careful not to overshadow. Eli presented his project about sound waves, explaining how vibrations traveled through different materials. Adrian listened intently, struck by the irony. Sound had reshaped their lives. The concept felt painfully personal. After the presentation, Eli approached them both, pride evident in his smile. For a brief moment, the three stood together, an echo of normalcy. A teacher complimented Eli's work, and Adrian responded with measured gratitude. Mara observed his restraint, the way he avoided touching her, the way he kept his voice even. It was not warmth, but it was control. The fragile balance faltered when another parent, unaware of the situation, asked Adrian casually, "How's married life treating you?" The question was innocent. Adrian felt heat rise in his chest. He glanced at Mara instinctively. She held his gaze for a split second before answering herself. "We're separated," she said calmly. The parent offered an awkward apology and drifted away. Adrian felt the familiar sting of humiliation, the public acknowledgement of fracture. He forced himself to remain composed, but the humiliation lingered like a bruise. On the drive home, he replayed the exchange repeatedly, imagining alternative responses that would have preserved dignity. That evening, he sent Mara a brief message, thanking her for handling the question with composure. The acknowledgement was deliberate, a small act of accountability. Mara read it twice before responding with a simple, "Thank you for not escalating." The brevity felt transactional, but it was honest. The criminal case moved slowly. Adrian's lawyer advised him that a plea agreement might minimize risk, but it would require admitting reckless endangerment. The label felt corrosive. Adrian resisted the idea fiercely. "I didn't endanger anyone intentionally," he argued. Calder's expression remained steady. "Intent is not the only factor," he replied. The prospect of a formal admission unsettled Adrian deeply. He had already admitted fault in personal spaces, but a legal record felt permanent. It would define him beyond therapy rooms and family discussions. He wrestled with the decision, oscillating between pragmatic acceptance and defiant denial. Lucas urged him to consider the long view. "You keep fighting the word," Lucas said, "but you don't fight the reality." Adrian snapped back that Lucas had not been in the kitchen that night, had not felt the pressure. Lucas did not raise his voice. "No," he said quietly, "but I've felt the aftermath." Meanwhile, Eli began spending alternating weekends at Adrian's house under the new custody arrangement. The first overnight visit carried quiet tension. Adrian prepared carefully, stocking Eli's favorite cereal and arranging the living room to feel welcoming. He avoided alcohol entirely, aware that even a single drink could undermine perception. That night, as Eli brushed his teeth in the bathroom, Adrian stood in the hallway listening to the mundane sounds. He realized how fragile this normalcy was. When Eli emerged and crawled into bed, he asked, "Are you still scared at night?" Adrian hesitated. "Sometimes," he admitted. Eli nodded. "Me too," he said. The honesty created an unexpected bridge. Adrian sat on the edge of the bed, not to lecture or reassure excessively, but simply to remain present. They spoke quietly about school, about friends, about nothing consequential. It felt ordinary, and ordinary felt miraculous. The calm was disrupted weeks later, when the court date finally arrived. The prosecutor offered a reduced charge in exchange for a guilty plea and mandatory continued counseling. Adrian sat in the courtroom, weighing pride against stability. Mara sat behind him, not as an adversary, but as a witness to consequence. When the judge asked for his plea, Adrian's voice felt distant from his body. "Guilty," he said. The word reverberated through the room with a different resonance than the gunshot, but it carried its own permanence. The judge outlined probation terms and continued therapy requirements. Outside the courthouse, Adrian felt both diminished and strangely lighter. The ambiguity had ended. The label was formalized. Mara approached cautiously. "I didn't want it to come to this," she said quietly. Adrian nodded. "Neither did I." The simplicity of the exchange carried more weight than previous arguments. The plea impacted his job definitively. HR terminated his employment within a week, citing company policy regarding criminal convictions. Adrian received the news in a short meeting devoid of personal sentiment. He left the building carrying a cardboard box of personal items, a cliché he once thought exaggerated. The loss destabilized him profoundly. He informed Mara and Lucas with minimal elaboration. Eli sensed the shift immediately. "Are you going to be home all the time now?" he asked. Adrian forced a small smile. "For a little while," he said. Financial strain introduced new pressure. Adrian began searching for work, but background checks complicated prospects. Each rejection email felt like confirmation of the label. He felt the old anger simmering, threatening to justify resentment toward Mara, toward the system, toward anyone but himself. During one therapy session, he admitted feeling humiliated. "I feel like everything I built evaporated," he said. Dr. Halpern listened carefully. "What did you build it on?" she asked. The question unsettled him. He realized that much of his identity had been constructed on external validation rather than internal stability. Mara observed the employment loss with conflicted emotions. She did not want Adrian destabilized, yet she feared financial dependency creeping into custody dynamics. They renegotiated child support terms temporarily, a conversation laced with tension but devoid of shouting. The civility felt fragile but intentional. Eli adjusted to the new routine slowly. He noticed that Adrian attended more school pickups now, that afternoons were quieter. He also noticed the fatigue in his father's posture, the way he stared at job listings late at night. "You'll find something," Eli said once, with earnest confidence. Adrian smiled, both comforted and burdened by the trust. Months passed with incremental stability. Adrian secured part-time work at a smaller firm, willing to overlook his record. The position paid less, but it restored a measure of dignity. He resisted the urge to frame it as a comeback. It was survival, not triumph. Mara finalized the divorce paperwork quietly. The signing took place in a lawyer's office devoid of ceremony. Adrian signed without protest. The finality felt heavy but unsurprising. They had not introduced new conflicts, but they had not restored what was broken either. Afterward, they stood in the parking lot once more, echoing earlier encounters. "We're not enemies," Mara said carefully. Adrian nodded. "I know." The statement was true and incomplete. They were not enemies, but they were not partners either. Eli adapted to two homes connected by a road that now carried regular traffic. The drawings he made featured both houses consistently, no longer divided by thick lines. The road was still there, but it looked less hazardous. Adrian continued therapy beyond the court mandate. He recognized that compliance alone would not sustain change. The fear of invisibility remained, but he was learning to tolerate it without reaching for control. The restraint still exhausted him at times, but collapse no longer felt inevitable. One evening, months after the plea, Adrian and Eli sat in the backyard watching the sunset. The air was quiet, unthreatening. Eli leaned back on his elbows and said, "It's not the same as before." Adrian nodded slowly. "No, he agreed. It's not, but it's okay, Eli added after a moment. The word carried cautious acceptance, not idealization. Adrian felt the weight of it settle inside him. Okay was not redemption. It was not restoration. It was stability earned through damage. He knew that the past would never disappear entirely. The sound would echo in memory, in legal records, in subtle hesitations, but he also knew that each restrained choice built something different from what he had before. Not control, not dominance, something quieter. The night deepened around them, free of sudden cracks or shouts. And for the first time since that gunshot tore through plaster and illusion alike, Adrian did not feel the need to freeze the moment. He simply let it pass, trusting that presence did not require force.